Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and I haven't made a video on schedule for a while. This is because I'm actually ill. I've contracted some sort of cold or flu, but I am on the mends. Nevertheless, I've decided to make this video about something I'm planning to do, but I did not want to release yet because I don't have the details, but it is simple enough that it would serve my purposes. With apologies. I am hoping to write a story. I'm doing it in between getting my psychology degree and other affairs in my life. So I don't know if I'll be completing it, or if I'll be releasing any of it, but I might put some of it on the channel for review. It is a story that, in some ways, would violate certain rules that I set for myself in storytelling. But the first rule that I created for storytelling for myself is that any rule, except the first one, can be suspended if for a valid reason. And when it comes to this sort of story, I need to suspend a rule. And that's because I don't just have general rules for general storytelling, but also rules for alternate timelines. One of the problems I have when most people write alternate timelines is that they tie them too closely to ours. I don't mind them doing so to an extent. But, to use an example, there's a novel called The Two Georges that is about them looking for a painting where George Washington is shaking hands with George III. It's an alternate timeline in which America lost the Revolution and America remained within the British Empire. The problem is you keep running into characters, and they're characters from our timeline who had, if not identical roles in their world to ours, very similar in terms of social impact. Like John F. Kennedy is in it, Martin Luther King is in it, you have a Richard Nixon in it, and so on. And to me that's silly, because if history were altered sometime in the late 18th century and played out very differently after that, then you would not expect all of these same people to have even been born. And I'm not talking about metaphysical ideas such as reincarnation. Certainly, if you believe that the soul pre-exists the body, you could say that they would still be born, something along those lines. But I'm talking about the actual persona they are living within. Why would the Kennedys even exist in this timeline? Not necessarily the whole family, but why would there be a John F. Kennedy? Why would there be a Richard Nixon? Why would there be a Martin Luther King? And of course, they do the same thing with events. It's almost like they took a modern history book, made one change, and then only edited historical events from there to try and force them into some sort of alignment. But in real life, history is more complicated than that. I don't really see how, for example, we would actually have history play out much the same way if America had lost the Revolution. And I'll try and discuss this in more detail when I'm feeling a bit better. But not to use The Two Georges specifically, because it's been a very long time since I've read it. Let's say that we're reading a story like The Two Georges in the sense that it imagines that America never left the British Empire. It lost the Revolution. But it still imagines America as a country that spans from sea to shining sea. There's still Alaska. And for the most part, America and Canada are distinct. And one would have to ask why that would be. For example, the reason America doubled in size was because of the Louisiana Purchase. And yet, the reason Napoleon sold Louisiana to America, and Louisiana was not just the state of Louisiana, it was the entire region going up to Illinois, was to finance his war with Britain, and it was shortly after the Revolution, so America still saw Britain as an enemy itself. But why would it gain Louisiana in this alternate timeline? And if I told the story and set it in the year 2020 and gave no explanation, it would be odd. You could, of course, give an explanation. Perhaps, for instance, they got Louisiana later. Perhaps they conquered it in the war or something along those lines. But it still seems odd that everything would fall into place the same way. And therein lies the problem that I have with a lot of alternate timelines. They go back and change one thing, but they keep too much the same thereafter. However, there is an exception to this rule, and that is if you're doing a stylized world, where even if the world is meant to be realistic as far as the story is concerned, you're doing these choices for stylistic reasons. And for the most part, though, if you do a stylized world, history, you'd probably have to do a stylized world as well. Which is sort of what I'm planning on doing. I'm planning on doing an alternate timeline, so that I could explore certain ideas philosophically, and how they would play out in the real history. And I was stuck with a quandary. I could, of course, during the drafting stages, I don't really care if I use real events or not, or if it makes sense that the same things would develop like I just complained about. Because in the drafting stages, you're only trying to build the framework of the story and you can go back and edit them and change them later. Another good example of that would be how sometimes if I'm writing a story, I'll use pre-existing characters from fairy tales or pre-existing film characters. I've often used the Disney princesses as love interests, for instance, in the stories, or as noblemen's daughters or such. But when I go back and edit them, I take the Disney princesses out and replace them with someone else. I choose the Disney princess who's closer personality-wise. But they're not supposed to be the Disney princess. I'm just using them as a placeholder. So if I'm doing a story, and I want to explore the ideas, for example, of Catholic versus Protestant ideas during the Reformation, but I don't want to set it in our timeline because I don't want people to get distracted by real historical events, but I do want to show how these ideas shape the formations of societies, which we can often overlook when we're dealing with real history. I could easily start in the draft stages with Martin Luther, his 95 Theses, John Calvin, and Albrecht Zwingli. But I could always go back later and take those names out and make certain key changes, which keep the ideas that they were pushing the same. The only problem I have with doing that is that it might become too divorced from the sources for people to really make the connection that this thing that I'm presenting in my fictional world is a direct analog to our real-world concepts. For example, if I took Luther's 95 Theses, reworded all of them but kept the idea the same, and then changed the number of them, such as if the first of his thesis is now the fifth, and if the third is now the first, and such, if I just randomized the order in which they appeared, people may or may not realize this is Martin Luther's 95 Thesis, especially today where we're poorly educated. And especially if they're not presented by Martin Luther, but by John Opfleisch, or by Peter Zingler, or that it happened in Asia with a man named Zui Quan. I would need to connect it to some way. And as such, I'm stuck with a quandary that I haven't quite resolved yet, of whether I should just leave the names of the sources or not. And I'm leaning toward a sort of weird middle ground where sometimes I leave the name and sometimes I don't. And I'm also thinking about introducing an idea where I simply tell the audience that this is a dramatization of a text that we received, a manuscript or some sort of written document that we decided to reenact, but in order to translate it and make it understandable to us, we placed in the names of our historical figures that had the same ideas, explaining it in the sense that in the quantum temporal mechanics that they understand in their advanced scientific world that I'm creating, they have learned that different timelines often run in parallel lines along energy, not form, which means that you could have two parallel timelines that aren't just similar in events physically, but are rather similar in thematic elements, which may or may not be scientifically sound, but it certainly helps with the narrative structure of a fictional story. And since it's a translation, we can still have, for example, going back to the two Georges, we can have George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, America's founding fathers, fighting an American Revolution, with the understanding that in their world they are not George Washington, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. We're just using those names because they're filling those roles to help the audience understand, and filling in certain details. Not that I think that people will think of this as our real history anyway, since I've made certain key changes already. For one thing, I used an old world map. This old world map had California as an island, and the shape of North America is a little more round and blunted. It looks, to my eye, smaller, although it's actually listed as about this right size. And I'm using this old world map, this old map of North America, as the way the continent is actually shaped, rather than an inaccurate map of the actual continent. What's more, the people in their world do not call it North America. They call it Avaloniya. They named it after Avalon from the Arthurian stories. And the same is true of South America, only they don't call it North Avaloniya, South Avaloniya. I haven't decided what South America is called, but it is going to be called something else. And by the modern period, where in our timeline we would have 3 countries on North America, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, they also have 3, but they follow the more normal pattern of how nations would form. And I really came up with this idea independently of the story, and it's not even like I came up with this idea first and then asked what else happened and built from there. This started out as a separate idea from the ideas that I had going into the story, but it seemed to fit. You see, most of the time, when nations are formed, they run along the mountains rather than over them, which is why the Native Americans were not as able to build a unified large empire like Europeans, because they would have to traverse the mountains, and the mountains run north to south largely in North America, whereas in Europe they run east to west, making it easier to transplant crops. For example, if you have a crop that grows very well at a certain latitude, you can take it all the way from Europe to Asia, and it should still grow fairly well, because it's at the same latitude with roughly the same weather conditions, whereas in North America, following the mountain lines, you're going farther north, and it simply may not, or you're going farther south, and it simply may not. And while I'm rather fond of the unusual rather than the usual, and our history had this unusual fact of crossing the mountains rather than going along them for the formation of the countries that we have. In this case, it's a good marker for how this is different. Now, I, in my head, have far more details than I'm going to give in this video. Partly that's just for brevity, but I also withhold some things because I want to be well when I say it, for one thing, and for another, I do want to present it in a more exciting way. But for the most part, I'm taking ideas from our real history, but not necessarily real events. I'm obviously going to look at real events to learn how things happen, but it's less about following the real history rigidly, and more about the philosophy. There are certain key points in real history that I'm going to translate to the new timeline. There are certain ideas that come up at certain times that I keep in those time periods. But I'm not going to be slavish about it and only certain points, and the other ideas can come along at different times that may be close but not necessarily aligning perfectly with it. But the action is set in what we call North America, only it looks like a map from the old world, the one that I've actually used in this video. And it is divided at the end by, well, when my story goes on anyway, into 3 parts. Only, rather than Canada to the north, the United States in the middle, Mexico to the south, we have the United Avalonian States in the east, Midgardia in the middle, and New Napon to the west. New Napon is actually a name that came from New Japan. Japan is actually called Napon. Japan is actually a Chinese term, for those who don't know, but in this timeline, Japan didn't really become so isolationist and actually discovered what we would think of as California, only it's an island, and named it New Napon, and eventually it started growing and expanding the Japanese Empire, even on the mainland. But then China conquered New Napon. It didn't necessarily conquer Japan, but it conquered New Napon, and it conquered the new Nepalese territories in the New World. And thus, New Napon became a blend of Chinese and Japanese culture. And after that, New Napon became independent and started forming its own unique culture, as well as taking cultures from other people it encountered. The United Avalonian States is basically their world's equivalent of the United States, a federal republic, only divided into 3 larger sections of a Northern Union, a Central Union, and a Southern Union, but still all united as a single federal union, and each union has states below them. So instead of being a 2-tier system of state and federal, it is a 3-tier system, which I'll elaborate more on later in another video. But Midgardia began by people from New Napon as well as the United Avalonian States, or before the United Avalonian States, the colonial era, going west, setting up their own trade routes, their own outposts, some of which being official or semi-official to governments, some not, some having some relations, some not, but over time, and taking in people from other parts of the world besides just the United Avalonian States or its predecessor colonies, or New Napon, it also developed other aspects and other things that happened. And there is something besides this that I would like to mention, but I want to save that for later in this video, and then elaborate on it much later as well. But, for certain reasons, Nune Pon did not explore Midgardia, as it became known, like the United Avalonian States or the people from Europe did. And the reason for that will become clear later on, but over time, you had this nation of Midgardia, and it divided into three great territorial unions as well, for want of a better term right now. They have the European Quarter, the Central Quarter, and the Asian Quarter, and that is what they'll be calling them. They'll be calling them quarters, even though there's only three. But it is a United Federal Republic, and Midgardia, even in the European or Asian quarters, is more blended than Nune Pon or the United Avalonian States would be, as a global or international melting pot. But a large part of this history is going to be based on fantasy novels, and I'm going to have to use copywritten characters in my head until I formulate exactly what they are in the stories, but I don't want to use copyright characters in this video, so right now I'm just going to point out that there was a certain villain who soared in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a great influence on me. This great Dark Lord fought 3 great wars, and he was not human, and there are elves and dwarves and such in this world. I'm including those sorts of elements that we typically think of as fantasy, because I've merged this largely with role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, and basic fantasy. Indeed, using this map, because I'm not really good at art, I actually used this map in games that had a very similar-ish sort of storyline. So, and I do like, or at least in the past, I used to play role-playing games. I haven't done so much since the plague hit. But basically, you have elves and dwarves and such. Now, in this world, they're not like in Tolkien. Elves and dwarves are not immortal. Well, elves are not immortal. In Tolkien, dwarves are not immortal anyway. They just have very long lives. Sorry for the pause. But in this world, the elves and dwarves lived much longer than humans, with the elves living about 360 years, the dwarves living about 240 years, and humans about 120 years. Now, these are maximum lifespans, not necessarily average lifespans, which will, of course, vary between time periods. However, during a drive for equality, the fairies modified the elves and dwarves. They debated the issue, and some thought they could just genetically alter them so they had shorter lifespans, but some thought that unfair, so they altered them and gave them an energy core, which made them more energy than they would have normally been. And I'll explain that in a moment as well. So that the dwarves and the elves and other races live about as long as humans do on Earth. And for all intents and purposes, as far as the way people see it, they live the same lifespan. This, however, isn't technically true. And that's because I'm going back to classical mythology, classical folklore, classical studies. A fairy is a step below the angels and a step above man. They're in this intermediate realm, and in our world it is mostly material with a little bit of energy. For want of a better term, I will explain it in greater detail. And for those who are interested in science, I know that energy is a property of matter. I know about the science behind it, but I'm using the term as we see colloquially used in science fiction and fantasy, such as For instance, if you were to watch Star Trek, they might have a being that says that, oh, we used to be material beings, but then we evolved into energy. That's the sort of terminology I'm using right now to get my point across. It's not meant to be technically accurate, but only to convey the concept. The material world requires a certain degree of energy to hold it together and to animate it, and it has that. But the material world has a little bit of energy and a lot of matter. On the other end of the spectrum, there's the spirit world, which is pure energy with no matter. And in between these two, there is a center location that's, roughly speaking, half matter and half energy. And that is where the fairies come from. And while the fairies wanted to give the human rulers what they wanted, there was a debate amongst the fairies and the fairy councils. And the debate was whether it was fair to actually shorten the lifespans of certain races just to make them equal to humans. But as it was pointed out, since fairies can see the future to some degree, if they didn't shorten their lifespans, the humans would eventually just hunt them down and kill them. So it was decided to compromise and create the illusion of age, even for the elves and dwarves and goblins and other things themselves. So, while for all intents and purposes, for everyday life, the elves, the dwarves, the goblins, and all the other races live about as long as humans do, presuming they die of natural causes, they will then be translated to another realm where they can live out the duration of their natural lifespan. So, let's say that you have an elf, and he's living a human lifespan, and he dies at the age of 90. Well, when he is reconstituted in this new realm where he can continue to live a natural lifespan, from human terms, he has the body of a 30-year-old, not a 90-year-old. Now, in elven terms, it wouldn't really be a 30-year-old, but just using how humans age to give you an idea of what they would look like, since they are basically humanoid. He would look like a 30-year-old man. He would have the body which is as fit as a 30-year-old man's, because he died at 90 and then was given his lifespan back. But he can never go back to the regular material world. He has to live in this pocket world, which is quite large. It's large enough to accommodate them. But he can't go back. And he also can't have children, because that was one of the compromised agreements. He can only have children whilst in his first lifespan, although he can be altered again so that he can have children if for some reason he did not have children in the original life he lived, and a council agrees to grant him the ability to reproduce. Which does happen, but most of this story is set in, for want of a better term, our material world, even though it's obviously not ours, it's definitely in an alternate timeline. The elves, the dwarves, the goblins, they're all humanoid, and they're all explained through evolution of all things. Evolution actually did lead to the creation of certain other hominids. There's Neanderthal man, for example, and this is essentially asking what if Neanderthals still existed and we had to deal with them, and what if they were the things like dwarves and such. And there were 3 great wars with this angelic force of great power that was eventually defeated in the 3rd war, or at least ostentatiously defeated, leaving human dominance unquestionable across the world. All of the humanoid creatures now have roughly equivalent lifespans, and there's a drive for equality, which leads to a revolutionary era, which leads us to our world that we have, that I've set up, which I'll go into more detail on later, though not too much, because I do want to keep some surprises. And I just thought I would explain all that, so that I could have a video. Well, I don't have much else to say, so I'll take my leave of you. Oh wait, there is one thing. I'm also, even though most of the action in this story is set in Avaloniya, which we call North America, I am going to deal with European politics as well, and Asian politics. For example, what we think of as the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, is there, although the Eastern Empire actually fell and was replaced in this timeline by the Byzantine Empire centuries later, which is a reconstruction of it. There was a British Empire, and there still is, and communism still came along, and so did a certain government led by Charlie Chaplin, who didn't like certain groups of people, especially those who are of a Jewish persuasion. And I'm going to deal with all of these ideas from a Christian perspective. And I'm going to base it on the storylines loosely on the plays of William Shakespeare, the plays of Thomas Middleton, another playwright from the Elizabethan and Jacobean period, and a few other Elizabethan and Jacobean playwrights and plays. Having said all of that, I will elaborate later if I decide to, because this is not a regular topic. And until then, I shall take my leave. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.